Welcome, everybody. I'm James Kleimann, the managing editor at HousingWire. And today we're going to be talking to Brooklee Han because she's been all over the NAR settlement, all the business practice changes that are going into effect on August 17th. So we're going to talk about cooperative compensation, suing your client. We're going to talk about how the brokerages may lose money or who's going to possibly gain market share. Brooklee, it is Thursday, August 15th. We are, less than 48 hours away from the day in which the NAR settlement business practices go into effect. It feels like, I remember going to the trial in Kansas City in October and thinking, you know what, this case is going to take years to go through the courts. There's going to be an appeal if the plaintiffs end up winning. And less than a year later, here we are talking about very significant business practice changes and lots of commentary about this idea that hundreds of thousands of agents are going to wash out, that commissions are going to drop potentially by a full point, right? 100 basis points. Agents, are they freaking out? How are they preparing for the big day?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right. It's crazy to think back to a year ago and see kind of what some of the major stories and trends were in the industry and where we were kind of in the process with these lawsuits. But here we are on August 15th, as you said. And I feel there's definitely some panic in the industry for sure, but I also feel like there's a sense of quiet confidence among a decent chunk of agents who are prepared, who have been training and preparing and practicing how to deal with these business practice changes. In some states, some of these changes went into effect already on July 1st.
Sure.
So, they've had a little bit of a head start. In other states, while there definitely are changes to the nature of the buyer representation agreement that, they're going to have to get buyers to sign, they've been dealing with these buyer rep agreements for years. So, agents who have had to deal with some of these things for a while are feeling pretty good about them. And then I feel like a lot of people, have a plan in place of how to deal with some of these changes, but they also are very aware of the fact that that plan might change, a week from today when they realize, 4 days into doing this, that what they had thought was going to work is not working the way they expected it to. So, I think nothing is really set in stone, and that is where some of this chaos a lot of people are expecting to see is coming from right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think one of the challenges here is it's still a very fractured market, right? Like no brokerage even has a significant percentage of the market. There are hundreds of MLSs. There are part-timers. There are hobbyists. There are full-timers. There's like 1%ers who are killing it and they only do luxury listings, right? Like there are so many different scenarios here when you think about a seller, a seller's agent, a buyer, probably a buyer's agent, and how these changes can manifest. And so the one thing that I've heard quite a bit in the last couple of weeks, I've been chatting with agents, and I should caveat this by saying most of the people that I speak to, these are professionals, right? Like they're not the side hustle type who do like a deal a year or 2 deals a year. And, they're otherwise like a PTA school leader, right? Like a PTA dad or mom or whatever. These are professional agents. This is their career, not just like, I can make an extra $20,000, doing a deal for my cousin or whatever. They've been telling me that they've done what you've already said, that they've been preparing for this for quite some time, that if and when they do buy-side deals, they've had buyer rep agreements for a long time. They didn't want to get caught flat-footed 2 years ago, way before anyone was even talking about these lawsuits, just in case, there was some sort of dispute or issue with a client and maybe the seller decided not to pay, right? So for the professional everyday agent, if they're dealing with other professional everyday agents, I think it's going to be relatively smooth sailing, right? The X factor, and it will probably be more than just an X factor, will be when you deal with somebody who doesn't maybe have the same level of experience, who is not as up to speed on a lot of these changes, and maybe works in a state that, did things a little bit differently than what they've read about in the news.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely something that a lot of these brokerage leaders have been talking about, that they have control over what their agents and brokers know in their practices. And they feel like they've prepared their agents and brokers well, but they don't have control over who's on the other side of the deal
Right.
and the training they have and what advice they've been given. And some, oh, yeah, they're very cognizant of that fact. And a lot of brokerages have been opening up their trainings to the wider kind of industry. We've seen the Real Brokerage release a playbook of different scenarios
Yeah.
and
So that.
how those might play out. I'm pretty sure it's Anywhere that has been opening some of its trainings to brokers and agents at other firms. So, a lot of people are extending those resources because they are aware of the fact that there might be, a small mom and pop brokerage that doesn't have the resources or abilities to do the trainings necessary, or there might be an agent whose broker just is not with it and is not helping them out, and they need that help. And I think everyone is willing to help agents and brokers who are, being proactive and wanting to learn and be educated. And even if I was an agent that felt like I, had the support of my own brokerage, I think it would be good if there was another brokerage in my, kind of region to go and see what they're telling their agents and brokers, so that
Sure.
when I come across that agent on the other side of a deal, I kind of know what to expect from them and how that situation is going to play out. So I can better prepare my clients for what that transaction might look like. And I can kind of be more on top of my game and learn things about what they're doing. I had a great conversation yesterday with Liz Geringer at Anywhere. She's, the head of the franchise side of that operation. And she said, one of the best parts of being in franchise is, like, yes, we are kind of the leaders, but we have all these independent leaders as well at all of, our franchises who have their own ideas, and we're able to come together and talk about, what are some of their ideas of what best practices are, because we're able to learn things and gain, different perspectives from all of these other leaders in the industry. And it's all within their own kind of umbrella.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, but it also cuts against, I think, a very salient problem for the
Yeah.
brokerage agent landscape, which is
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about the raw numbers, right? We're talking about, give or take, 1.5 million agents. A very significant percentage of them don't transact very often, do much. And a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
brokerages are making money on the fees of keeping those
Yeah.
agents, as part of the operation. Are they
Mm-hmm.
participating in the training? If they never took it seriously to begin with, are they going to do it now? And I think that's really a
Yeah.
question that a lot of these brokerages are going to need to wrestle with, especially the ones whose business model is, we want as many agents as possible.
Absolutely. And, we saw that last week with ReMax's earnings call, when they kind of casually mentioned that they would, consider changing their revenue model, because they do have a model that's based off of having a lot of agents. They also, have a lot of very high performing agents
They
as
do.
well.
Yep.
And so, I think that's going to be definitely a boost for them as they, navigate this with the rest of the industry. But I think a lot of other brokerages are going to be looking to entice those top agents and highly productive agents away from, the ReMaxes and the other brands that have a lot of these top agents, because they're going to need someone to keep kind of their flag flying, basically.
I think there's another wrinkle here, which is in the conversations that I've had with a lot of brokerage leaders and agents, especially agents in the last couple of weeks. And again, I caveat this by saying, for the most part, I'm talking to the professionals who are more listing heavy, and this is really not eye-opening to me because it makes sense, but they don't want to be dealing with the buy side. They don't want to be buy side agents. They want to focus, they're going to be focusing their businesses going forward on being a listing agent and not getting into the scuttlebutt of, all the drama, all the complications, all the issues on being on the buy side, and just in general, because there's a lot less certainty when you're on that side of the transaction. And it's funny because I used to cover luxury real estate at another publication, and it was always thought of as you get the listings, you kind of control your own destiny. And I think that's going to really start to come into prominence a lot more just throughout the country. We're not even talking about luxury markets, right? But just that you have, as an agent, your business is a lot more durable if you control the listings and you are not out there hustling, trying to get a buyer to sign this agreement. You're getting a lead from Zillow or Realtor or whomever, and you're trying to close a very different kind of transaction given all the changes that have now taken place. I think it's just that much harder and that much less certain. And I'm curious to hear if you've heard from other agents or any brokerage leaders about, is there going to be a move from kind of top agents who do both buy side and sell side to just doing sell side?
I remember a couple of years ago talking to, a real estate educator, and I was like, what's your best advice for new agents? And he was like, get over to the list side of the transaction as soon as humanly possible. So I feel like that's kind of always been the advice that's out there, and kind of what agents have as like this end goal. And I mean, in the natural life cycle of an agent, say you start out, on the buy side of deals as a buyer's agent. If you do a good job, which you ideally do, that same home buyer that you helped will then call you, right, 5-10 years time to list the house.
And they'll tell their cousin maybe, kind of, and
exactly,
spin out 300 deals, right? Ideally.
Yeah. So, I feel like that is what kind of everyone expected as the natural life cycle of a real estate agent. But yeah, I think, a lot of people are definitely emphasizing being on the listing side right now, especially. But I think the agents who really excel at working with buyers and are able to provide tangible value and excellent top-notch service to their buyers are still going to be able to be successful. And they might even find more success as more agents shift over to the list side of the deal, because I'm pretty sure a lot of buyers will still want help and guidance through this transaction. I don't think that's going to, it might change 15 years from now if we're having this conversation, but this isn't a switch that's going to happen overnight. So in the meantime, I think the agents who really excel on the buy side of the deal, if they have fewer competitors on the buy side, they might even be more successful if they're able to, really, really serve their clients well.
I think that's a good point. And I was chatting yesterday with a top real estate agent coach, and he was telling me that he thinks there are a fair amount of strong, solid performing kind of buy side heavy agents, and they're going to start migrating more to these large teams because there are just going to be more opportunities, and like people are always going to be drawn to where the listing is, right? Because you can't buy anything without a listing. And so if you start to think about this idea that there's going to be more consolidation, and maybe, teams offer more services, and part of that is, there are going to be a lot of more unrepresented buyers, and potentially we can just refer you to someone on the team, and they're a buy-side agent specialist. Now, you get into larger questions about not dual agency in a specific sense, but are they representing the buyer's best interest? And I think that's another major point that we haven't quite reckoned with, and probably won't be able to suss out for another 6 months. How are the buyers going to interact with agents, especially on the lower end of the market, right? Where they don't have an extra $6,000, $7,000 to pay a buyer's agent if, the seller opts not to pay through a commission or a concession that eventually moves over to the buy side, right? So that's, I think, where we're going to start to see a lot more movement, I guess you could say, right? Like we'll start to see how sticky these relationships are when the rubber meets the road, and, suddenly a seller doesn't decide, yeah, I'm going to give you 1.5% or 2% to pay your buyer's agent for their services. Not going to pay anything, and you got to put your best foot forward and is it just going to be a sort of situation where if you're a buyer, you need to have that as part of your budgeting process? Okay, the house is going to cost $350,000. I know that I'm probably going to have to pay $10,000 toward, closing
Yeah.
costs, including my agent. And that means my limit is going to be, you know, $345,000 once everything's said and
Mhm.
done. Is that going to change kind of how people think about what their budget is?
Yeah, I definitely think it will. Or if it doesn't, they'll find out very quickly if we discover that all of the sellers, all of a sudden, no one wants to, offer any concessions, that they are going to be forced to think about things that way. Um, I think the scariest part of all of this for a lot of people in the industry is that we don't know what the consumers are going to do.
Right.
No one can really say definitively this is exactly how the consumers are going to react and this is exactly what they're going to do. And it's we don't know what's going to happen until we start seeing it in practice. And I think a lot of it will have to do with the market conditions in whatever metro area you're in. And we also have to remember that like none of this is happening in a vacuum, because we also have what's going on with mortgage rates, what's going on with
Mhm.
inventory, kind of other macroeconomic factors that people are factoring into their decisions to buy or sell right now anyway. And it's going to be, it might be hard, especially in some markets, to see exactly what the implications are kind of market wise and consumer behavior wise from these business practice changes.
Yeah, that's a great point because there are so many bigger factors right now: interest rates, the
Mm-hmm.
inventory in your specific market. Like, I don't care what the inventory looks like in Indiana. You know what I mean? Like, I'm in New Jersey or
Yeah.
I'm in Texas, and my picture is a lot
Mm-hmm.
different in the way my local agents are going to be handling the situation. Or maybe I'm in a market where there are a lot more home builders, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
changes the options that I have. And in some cases, like in parts of Florida, parts of Texas, some of these big national home builders are offering huge incentives to agents to
Mm-hmm.
find a buyer who's willing to, sign on the dotted line and buy a $750,000 home in God wherever. I don't know Florida or Texas very well. So I think every market is different. And
Yeah.
when I talk to people who are a little bit closer to my home, I'm in Brooklyn, and a good chunk of my family is in the suburbs in New Jersey. That's totally different. There's still no inventory. It's super tight. If you're not factoring in the buy side agent compensation as a buyer into your offer from the jump, you're not going to get the house, just straight up.
Yeah.
The offers that are winning in a lot of cases, not every case, and this is not necessarily true in other markets where inventory isn't as tight. But if you're not thinking about covering at least a good chunk of your buy side agent costs, the seller has better options. They're going to choose somebody who
Mm-hmm.
does, or who has, waived all kinds of other concessions. And so it's going to depend so much on the local market that you're in.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the thing. It's easy to catastrophize a lot of this and think like, oh my God, like, the agent experience is going to be radically different on August 17th, and home consumers are going to be confused, and it's going to be a total mess. And like, yes, that's possible. That's totally possible. But the bigger
Yeah.
factors are still going to be the home prices, the
Mm-hmm.
inventory, and the cost of financing, the mortgage rates, right? And so we're still talking about like maybe the fourth biggest factor when it comes to a home. So I think that's,
Absolutely.
just something worth bearing in mind when we do talk about, oh, what happens when the seller decides not to play ball and offer any kind of form of a concession.
Yeah, and I mean, as you said, if it's a seller's market and they decide to do that, then they're probably still going to sell their home pretty quickly, because there's going to be someone who is able to make it work somehow. But if it's a buyer's market and the buyer has other options where sellers are a little bit more flexible, that home might sit. And I think that's definitely going to be an interesting statistic to watch as we move forward. I'm in southern New Hampshire. It's been a pretty hot market, but there's several houses kind of in my town even that have been sitting on the market for the entire
Right,
summer,
like
for at
90-day
least like about
plus,
8
like,
weeks.
yeah,
Yeah.
nothing's moving, right? Yeah,
And
yeah.
the home, they haven't dropped the price at all. And so I'm interested to see, if I could get an inside look into the deals when they eventually do happen, if those sellers would be willing to, offer concessions to the buyer that they eventually get, or if they're gonna, kind of not be willing to budge and that house just sits even longer. So a lot of it also has to do with the kind of motivation and time frame that the seller is looking to have as well, because even if they're in a seller's market and they need to get out in a month, that would, being willing to consider all offers and any form of concession, they would definitely probably still move their property pretty quickly.
And I think when you look at, let's say, over the next 6 months from August 17th through, what would that be like? March, February? God, I need to get better
February.
at math. I need to work on that. February 17th, when we look at the number of deals in which a seller offered a concession, whether it ends up being just an offer that was made upfront on their website, right? Saying we're going to be paying, our seller is going to be paying buyers 3%. And according to the settlement is still perfectly legal and in accordance to, good law at this stage, right? Or that they're willing to negotiate and that they're going to offer 2.5% in concessions or whatever it ends up being. I still think, despite there being still a lot of sellers markets in this country, despite us still being short on inventory, which will continue for years, most sellers will still be making an offer to the buying party that can be put toward the services of that buyer's agent. In most deals, I think that's not going to change, but we are going to see a lot more friction. We're going to see a lot more just in terms of the number of variables in the negotiations because the game has changed, right? And what I mean by that is it's now top of mind. If you are in the marketplace right now, you're buying and selling, it's part of the thing you ask when you talk to your agent about marketing your home or the homes to buy, because you either sign an agreement upfront as the buyer or as the seller. It's part of your marketing strategy, right? So it can't just be an assumed, oh, well, like this is the standard paperwork and my agent will get three, that agent will get three, and that's that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think to your point, affordability is such a challenge across the country that I don't think we're going to see a massive change within the next 6 months of, sellers all of a sudden saying, no, we're not going to offer any concessions or help, buyers out at all. Yeah, it's going to be interesting for sure. We're in for a ride.
Making it even more challenging is the fact that we have so many different jurisdictions and we have so many MLSs and state, bureaus that say one thing and then the MLS says another, like, Colorado, for example, right? So in Colorado, you have buyer contracts. The State Realtor Association says one thing, but the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies says another. So, do home buyers need to have a signed buyer agency agreement before touring a home in those areas? Well, if you're an agent, they're like, who do you listen to? Do you listen to the MLS, which says, yeah, you do, and they're the ones who typically enforce a lot of the codes and the rules, or is it the state and they say, you don't need one. So
Yeah,
it's
that
really
is.
tricky.
Yeah. And I mean, I know that has been an issue for some of these national brokerages who have, come up with policies themselves of how they want things enforced. And, the way the local MLS is enforcing things by, maybe allowing for seller concessions to put a percent or a dollar amount in the MLS. And the brokerage has decided they don't want any part in doing that, no matter if it's a concession that's only allowed to go toward title insurance or something like that. So they have created their own forms in those states or in those jurisdictions just to kind of have it very clear to their agents and their clients that these are the practices that we're using, and explaining why they've decided to take the route that they've taken, even though other options are allowed. So yeah, it's definitely, it's a lot for some of these brokerages to deal with, because as you said, every jurisdiction is different. And so I think everyone kind of knew that, previously, but it's even clearer now that real estate is very, very local,
Yep.
especially with all the chaos.
I wanted to touch on one last point because I think it's super important, uh, because it's a bit scary. And you published a story on Tuesday titled "To Sue or Not to Sue: How Buyers Agents Should Prepare for Commission Disputes with Clients." And so this is a bit of bag of snakes, right? So maybe can you walk us through this one? Explain to us why they would be potentially suing. What are the stakes involved here, and what are the industry leaders saying you should do if there is potentially a dispute between a buyer's agent and their client?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of when this would arise would be, there's two instances. One, you're working with your buyer, they sign a buyer representation agreement, you agree on 2%, let's say,
Right.
of the sale price of the house. And they find a house, they love it, they put in an offer, and there's negotiations back and forth, and the seller finally is like, all right, I'll give you 1.5%. And so that would mean then the buyer, based on the contract they have with their agent, are on the hook for whatever the 0.5% is, dollar wise, in order to fulfill the amount that their agent is due at the close of the transaction for helping them. The other scenario is, you get to the closing table and it might be the same thing, 1.5%. And the buyer is like, look, you sucked at your job. Like, you didn't really do anything that you said you were going to do on the buyer rep agreement. Like, you were a terrible agent, and like, we don't want to pay you any more than, what you're just going to get from the seller. And so in that case, the agent is left with this decision, basically, do, I enforce the contract and potentially have to sue my buyer for that, whatever the dollar amount is of that 0.5%? Or do I just say, all right, fine, I'll take it and, take what you get, kind of thing, and move on with your life? And, on the one hand, if you did do a great job, that definitely, I could understand why you would potentially want to sue. But at the same time, if you're going around suing all your clients for a 0.5%, which it might be, a couple $1,000s,
It's going to be hard to get more clients, right?
it's going to be hard to get more clients. You're definitely not going to help them sell that house in 10 years time. And you're definitely not going to get any recommendations.
Sure.
So,
and your brokerage is
do
not going
you
to be
just
happy either, right?
Exactly, because their name will be dragged through the mud as well, basically.
It's a no-win scenario.
No, it isn't. So
Or
I
do you
think
try to
everyone,
spike the deal before it even gets to closing, right? So that's another
yeah.
option.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's tricky. And I do think these scenarios are not absurd. These are probably going
No.
to happen.
And I mean, a lot of people say they already do happen sometimes, in this day and age. So that was interesting to hear as well. And, I think a lot of agents are also frustrated, having been in, a cooperative compensation world where, maybe they are providing excellent service to their buyers, but they're kind of at the mercy, if they don't have that buyer rep agreement, of whatever, the listing agent is kind of, and the seller have negotiated as what their commission will be. And if their buyer falls in love and, gets an offer accepted on a house that's, maybe only offering 1.5% or 1%, that's what they get. Unless they're unless they have that agreement and their buyer is willing to kind of uphold their end of the bargain on that. So it's, yeah, I understand where the frustration is coming from for sure, but it definitely is a no-win scenario. But I think a lot of people are feeling that if you don't sue and just say, okay, that's fine, I'll take whatever, you're going to be able to, end up with more business down the road anyway that will make up for, whatever you may have missed out on.
Yeah, tough choices. Awesome. Brooklee, thank
Yeah.
you so much. We really appreciate you being with us today. We've got a couple days left. So if anyone has any tips, share any information, let us know how it's going on August 17th. We're going to be posting some stories and we'll have just some feedback from top agents, lenders, brokerage leaders through the weekend. So stick with us. Brooklee, thanks so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.